Okay. Look, Mommy's got one too.
He's got his grandmother's eyes. He's all funny.
I ran a store in Minden, downtown Minden, for nearly 50 years. But that is not what I'm mostly remembered for. I was the oldest living veteran living in Minden. I was born in Old Minden Parish in 1845. When I was 15 years old, my parents sent me to Pineville, Louisiana, to a school called the Louisisana Seminary of Learning and Military Institute, which you know better as LSU. The head of that school was the infamous William Tecumseh Sherman. When the war broke out in May of 1862, I came back to Minden and joined Company G of the 12th Louisiana Infantry. I went to Georgia, fought a lot in Georgia, Tennessee, was wounded in the Battle of Atlanta. And when I had to surrender in May of 1865, I had to surrender to the same General Sherman who had been the head of my school. After the war, I came back to Minden. I worked as a store clerk in this store, and eventually I owned this store. In 1933, I was 88 years old. They dedicated a statue to the memory of the Confederate soldiers, and I was allowed to unveil the statue. They had a band and everything there, and I really enjoyed that. I lived only 4 years after that. I was going on 92 years old when I finally died. I learned a lot. I saw a lot of changes in Minden and in this country during that time. Thank you.
I'm so glad you came to visit me today. My name is Jacqueline Taylor. Folks from miles around called me Aunt Jack. I ran the hotel downtown on Broadway Street. Oops, I forgot. You call that Main Street today. But it's in that same building where Robert's Music Store is. Well, you know, the favorite thing of mine to do is to please my customers. And everybody said that I showed more hospitality than anybody in these parts. And there must have been something to that, because the day they buried me in 1930, every store in town closed down, and everybody came up the hill to my funeral. It's nice to know you were appreciated for things that you did when you were among the living. Well, after those living folks left the hill that day, I attended my first town meeting up here in this community of the dead. Chris Chaff, whom you'll meet later, is in charge of things up here. And Chris and I are sort of kinfolks. My daughter married into the Chaff family. But I don't think it was because of kinfolks that he chose me to be the official greeter. I think it was because I did that so well when I was among the living, and of course because I'm right here by the entrance. But now they do have some politics up here in this community of the dead. Since Chris Chaff is in charge of everything, you would just wonder why it wouldn't be Colonel Lewis, because Colonel Lewis and his wife donated this property for the cemetery to be on. But guess what Colonel Lewis did? After the late unpleasantness, if you know what I mean, the war between the states, Colonel Lewis changed to Republican. Well, nobody could get over that. No one ever forgave him, and long before I got here, everyone had agreed that Chris Chaff would be in charge of things. And I don't want you to be disturbed about these old-style clothes that we have on. We're kind of in a bind, you understand? We have to stay in what they buried us in. But today, I did manage to get this apron on because I so wanted to share with you some of that delicious, famous food from my hotel. But since we're on different planes, I couldn't do that. We can only communicate. But they are serving some refreshments this afternoon over at the Coca-Cola plant, and they want everybody to come over and share in that fellowship. Well, I'm so glad that you came today, but I want to remind you of one thing. The next time you're in downtown Minden, drive by Jacqueline Park. Guess what? They named it after me. And that's the park where they have the bandstand. Oops, there I go again. Y'all call that the gazebo. But they named that park after me, and I'm so grateful that they chose to preserve my memory by naming a park after me. So be sure and drive by Jacqueline Park the next time you're in town. I'm so glad you came to see me today. Head on this way with your guide and meet some of the other folks in the community of the dead.
We'll see you next year.
Good afternoon, and welcome to our little community. I'm Lila Stewart Simon, and it's a pleasure to meet you. I was born right here in Minden on February 23rd, 1906, in the house that was my home for almost all my life. You may know it as the Farley House on the corner of Homer Road and Elm Street, right across the street from the Ferguson House. You probably know that house as the Webster Parish Library. My father was Dan Stewart. He was a lawyer in Minden for many years. When I was growing up, everyone called me Babe. I went to college in Missouri and then to SMU because I wanted to be in the newspaper business. That's how I met my husband, Hubert Spiva. He was a newspaperman and he was a correspondent all over the world. He continued that for a while after we got married in 1929. But a few years later, we moved back to Minden and began publishing the local newspaper. Shortly after we came back to Minden, Hubert died, leaving Tam and me. Tam is my son, Hubert Tamlin Spiva Jr. I enjoyed running the paper and we were very successful. In 1956, I sold the paper, but I kept the printing business until 1959 when I died. By the way, my son became a writer and producer. But you may have seen him on the Brady Bunch show. He wrote quite a few of them, including the ones where the family went to Hawaii. I bet you didn't know that story came from someone in Minden. Hope y'all enjoy the rest of your tour.
Well, I'm glad we got all that Webb story straight for you. Always has been some confusion on the Webb history. I was born October 7th, 1856, on a farm about 15 miles north of Minden. My father later built a townhouse in Minden in about 1859. That house still stands today on East and West Street. I finished school at the Minden Male Academy, which was across the street from my house. Y'all call it Academy Park today, but that's where the old Male Academy stood. I went to work at my father's store at the age of 16 in 1872 and remained there until 1888 when I went into business for myself and opened Webb Hardware and Furniture Company. This store, I'm proud to say, became the mainstay for Minden and the surrounding communities for many generations. Now, for you who do not remember Webb Hardware, it was in the heart of Minden, right on Main Street. And I think the old warehouse sign is still up on Union Street. I ran this business for 42 years until 1930. However, I was involved in other areas of the local community. I was the founder and first president of the Minden Cotton Oil and Ice Company in 1901 and remained president until 1927. I was also an original shareholder of the Minden Cotton Compress Company, whose building still stands today on the southwest corner of Sibley Road and Shepherd Street. I was also an original stockholder of the railway company, which was eventually bought out to become part of the L&A Railroad. Now, unlike the other Webb brothers, I did marry. My wife was Sally Drake, daughter of Hervey Drake, another prominent Minden merchant. We had 2 children. One died in infancy. The other, Juliet Webb, married Cornelius M. Hutton. Cornelius and Juliet had 2 daughters. Juliet Hutton married Charles Alden Rathbun, and today their son, Charles Rathbun, lives in a house that I built on Broadway. Sally Hutton married Dr. C.S. Sintel, and their son and grandson, Sherburne Sintel Jr. and Sherburne Sintel III, today practice law in Minden.
I'm Belle Vance, Belle Pratt Vance. I was born in Homer in 1852, but I lived here in Minden most of my life, so I consider myself a native. You see, that's important to me because I don't like to admit it, but my parents, they were Yankees. My father, Luther Pratt, was born in New Hampshire, and my mother, Dorliska Rathburn, was born in New York State. They moved to Louisiana after they were married and opened a little store in Overton. Have you ever heard of Overton? It was a little town that was on the bayou back before Minden was here. The folks kept dying from the yellow fever, and eventually the town disappeared. They say you can't even see it now. It's under the pits that they dug the gravel out of. That's called the bar pits. My family moved to Homer, where I was born on Valentine's Day in 1852. And eventually we moved to Minden so I could go to school. I graduated as the valedictorian of my class from the Minden Female College in 1869. I remember the big party that my father threw for me at the house after graduation, but I really wanted it to be over with because my brother had offered the first girl in our family to graduate with honors $100. And in 1869, that was a lot of money. I married Dr. T.J. Vance, and we built our first home on Broadway. People around here know it as the Sugg home, when in fact it was the Vance home. My nephew, Mr. Sugg, inherited it after I died. On my 81st birthday, the newspaper interviewed me, and I told them that I saw a lot of things change in Minden. And I told them that there was half as much meanness in the world when people were permitted to have whiskey. There was nothing I liked more than a little whipped cream flavored with whiskey. But after that interview, my health started to fail, and I knew that my time was soon near an end. And I wrote this letter to my children. My dear children, having lost so many dear relatives and friends in the past, and fully realizing that the time will soon come when we, who are waiting, shall answer like them to the summons to come, I've decided to write a few lines on death, hoping they will lessen the shrinking which so many feel when ready to cross the narrow sea. What lessons for life in each scene of death? Whether in the lordly palace or wretched hovel, a sad lesson will be learned. We see the smiling babe whose life went out like a shattering flower. Look at the distracted mother, trying in vain to shield her helpless darling from the icy king. She sees life give way and the last ray of breath go out with a sigh. Look at man. He walks forth in the pride of health and strength and bids defiance to the grim monster. Yet, look again. The meek Christian passes calmly and peacefully through the veil of eternity with these words on his lips. Death's but a path that must be trod if man would ever pass to God. But why the horror felt at the moment of dissolution? The pomp of death is far more terrible than death itself. Life is uncertain and full of trials. I died in 1933, and I was buried here at sunrise. I loved Minden, and I thought it was one of the prettiest towns in the state, especially the boulevard where I lived. And I hope you come back to visit me sometime.
Class will now begin. It's good to see all of you here. I don't have a list of your names, I'm afraid, so I can't call roll this afternoon. But I'm glad to see you. I'm Mildred Boyle Webb, and I was born September 29, 1842, in Tennessee. My father died shortly after I was born, and my mama married Mr. Turnley. Mr. Turnley and Mama had my little sister Emily, who is here. Mr. Turnley also died, and Mama, Emily, and I moved to Minden. I enrolled in the female college here in Minden, and I graduated at the age 15, the valedictorian of my class of 1858. I loved school, and I knew that I wanted to teach. After graduation, I began teaching out of my home. And then the college called me back to teach. Well, I was delighted to go back and teach my girls. In 1876, Dr. Bright, the president of the college then, had to resign because it was during Reconstruction and it was a very, very hard time. We had a hard time finding someone to take that position, and eventually they gave me the position. But they did not make it president, they made me principal, which made me mad. I wanted to be president. But you know, they didn't have lady presidents back in those days. So I became the principal and enjoyed my role as teacher principal. And then Colonel Benton came, and he became the president. And I went back to the classroom full time, which I did enjoy. I was failing in health, though, about that time. And I began as a governess for Dr. Stephen Webb's children. It was easy for me to get that job because I had been courting Dr. Stephen Webb's brother, Samuel Webb, who also was a doctor. He was a dentist, very fine one. As you know, teachers have to have a lot of patience. Well, Dr. Samuel Webb sure tested mine. We courted for 15 long years before we married. Probably the longest courtship in Webster Parish. But we finally married, and we moved into a big house on East Union Street. I gave up teaching, and he died in 3 years. A very short marriage. He left me, though, financially well off, which I was grateful for. I did not have to go back to work. I worked instead for the church, for the Methodist Church, and for the Women's Temperance Union until my death, which was May 29, 1927. One of my former students had this to say at my passing. The senior class of 1875 was most loyal and devoted to their teacher. And all through the years that intervened between June 1875 and the day when she was called to her reward, they remained constant in their admiration and love, realizing that they had been greatly helped by her example and gentle influence. What a wonderful way to be remembered. Class dismissed.
Hello. What an interesting group of you are today. I guess my clothes look as strange to you as yours do to me. Let me introduce myself. My name is Sarah Ann Munzingo Killen. I was born, as you can see, in 1828, but I was not born here in Webster Parish. I was born in Harris County, Houston County, Georgia in 1828. When I was 20 years old, my family decided to leave Georgia and come up to Louisiana where some of our relatives were living. So we hitched up a wagon train. The wagon train consisted of many families, and it took many days to get here. One young man I met on the wagon train, his name was Sidney Killen. He was a single man, he was not married, but he did carry a slave with him, Sidney Cornelius, on the trip. While we traveled, I got to know Sidney, and we made a match and decided to marry when we reached North Louisiana. We settled in what is known as Claiborne Parish, near here. And Sidney and I got married on October 4th, 1849. We settled down and had a happy life here. We had a farm. Eventually we had 8 children. And Sidney served on the state legislature of Louisiana. He was serving in the legislature when Webster Parish was formed. We joined the First Baptist Church in Minden, and we went there for several years, but then they built the Shady Grove Baptist Church near where we lived, and so we spent the rest of our life in that church family. We had 8 children, and after our children were grown, we bought the Bright Place and moved into Minden. It is on what you call the Shreveport Road, across from what you call Nita's Barbecue. Some of our grandchildren lived with us, and others came to visit often. Sidney died in 1901, and I moved in with my daughter, Mrs. Turner. She is back. Some of our children are back here behind me. I was living there when I passed away in 1913. I always loved Minden, and I hope you enjoy visiting our cemetery today. Thank you.
How y'all doing this afternoon? I guess Aunt Jack told you that I was kind of the official mayor up here. Even though I was never in politics, I was just a real entrepreneur of these parts. I came over here to Minden from England in the early 1800s. I came off the boat in New York, and I came down here with my brother John. And when I first got here, I was a blacksmith by trade. And the way I was a blacksmith and the way I left England was I shoed horses for Sir Walter over there, and he thought I was abusing his horses, so I just kind of got mad one day and threw my hammer down, and me and my wife and my first son came over here, and we started with blacksmith. Of course, my first son, Joseph, is buried right over here. He died at a very early age after we got over here. We'd gone to Shreveport one day on one of the stagecoaches that I owned, and he came down with some type of fever. And I think it was from that squirrel skin hat he had on his head. But anyway, after that, we had 4 more children. This was a real thriving area, and since I was such an entrepreneur, I decided to open an inn. So I opened an inn, and of course, a lot of carpetbaggers and people like that stayed there. And one of the carpetbaggers decided he was going to run for mayor at one time. When none of us folk in this area, we wanted a carpetbagger as the mayor of Minden. So we all decided we'd elect our own mayor. So we just wrote in my bull as the mayor, and Minden had the first bull mayor. And I mean, he was really a bull, not just a bunch of bulls. So anyway, I also had a foundry. I built my own stagecoaches also. My biggest success was my stagecoach line. I had stagecoaches that ran from Minden, North Louisiana, up to Mississippi, down to Longview, Texas. And I also had the mail route in all these areas. Well, everything was running great and everything was doing fine. And the trains came along. Well, that kind of knocked a dent in my success as a stagecoach line. And a lot of my mail started going to the stagecoach line. Well, somewhere along in that area, my wife, Jeannie, which is buried here, she decided we didn't need to raise our family at the inn. So we built a real big, fine home across the street from the inn. Well, if y'all don't know where my inn and my blacksmith shop was, it was where the old Gulf Station was. Well, you probably don't know where the old Gulf Station was. The old Gulf Station is where Moss Eye Care is. And our home was across the street, right in the parking lot where the Minden Medical Center is. Well, it burnt down. We don't know how it burnt down, but we just know it burnt down. So about age 70, I had to start all over again. Well, that was about the time the stagecoach lines came across and did me in on my mail route. So we went back to doing the blacksmith and the livery stable and had a great big success at it. Well, after I came to live up here about 15 years, I thought I was going to have peace and quiet and no problems with those blamed old trains. Well, wouldn't you know it? They built the train line right down here at the foot of the hill. So over 100 years now, I've listened to those trains come back and forth. And the depot is also built down there also. Well, the next person y'all are going to go see is Alfred. Well, not really Alfred. It's Captain Alfred. I've known him as Alfred since we were teenagers. We were good friends. So y'all run right over here and see what Captain Alfred's got to tell you. Who's your wife? Y'all on tour, my great-grandson, that's that Agan.
Well, hello there. Won't you come and gather around? Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Alfred Goodwill, or Cap Goodwill, if you will, or Captain Goodwill. I and my family have been around here for now on to a couple hundred years. As perhaps some of you may know, this has been my current resting place for the last 99 years, having come here to join a number of my friends in 1904. You see, I was not from this area, as many of the folks in my generation and my parents' generation. We, of course, came from abroad. In my case, England. Oh, when I was an early teenager, we lost my mom, and my dad decided, let's go to the New World. Didn't know many folks in the New World, but did know one J.C. Chaff. Have you met Chris Chaff earlier? Well, if you haven't, probably you will. But Dad took us to New Orleans, and we left New Orleans, and this is about 1849, headed north to Minden, to the area then Claiborne Parish. You know, Webster Parish didn't come along until later. All of this area was Claiborne Parish. Unfortunately, on the way up here, my dad died, and I was an orphan at 19. Knowing only one person within the United States, that being J.C. Chaff. Well, I came to Chaff, and he was kind enough to give me a job in his then mercantile business. Don't mean to brag, but I was a fairly good worker. I was fairly clever. And before too long, I was able to branch out on my own with my own mercantile store and businesses. And with the grace of the good Lord, I was financially successful and began buying property in the area. In fact, some of that property still remains in my family's hands to this day. Streets are named for me within town, and perhaps some of you have taken my exit off Interstate 20, Goodwill Road exit. Yes, that's named for me. In the more modern times, mentioned that I was cap or captain. Well, that came from a commission that I received when the Civil War came along. That war of northern aggression as we know it. No, I did not make it into battle, but I stayed at home to see to the muster of troops, to look for supplies, and see that our troops had what they needed to wage against the aggressors from the north. You see here I have my ceremonial saber. Sometime after my passing, young people, to show their bravery, would go to my house. They would go upstairs and take this sword and wave it out an upstairs window to show their bravery, perhaps to show their bravery against my ghost, particularly on Halloween. I and my wife had a daughter, and her name was Olive. And as luck would have it, Olive married a Robert Roberts. Perhaps some of you will recognize that name. Rather well known in Shreveport in the oil business these days, I'm told. That Olive and Robert had a daughter. Guess what they named her? Another Olive. She in turn married a Mr. Foster, a senior Mr. Murphy J. Foster, and they in turn had a son who would have been whom? Governor Mike Foster, my great-great-grandson. Now, while Governor Mike did not know much about North Louisiana and very seldom came here during his tenure as governor, he did come to visit me on several occasions, even before he became governor. And I am proud to say that now past Governor Mike has been very supportive of our Cemetery Association financially. I want you to know that I'm pleased that you've come to visit Old Cap Goodwill, and maybe you can spread a little of my memory along and say hi to some of my friends as you travel about my home. Have a good one.
Thank you.
Hello, how are y'all doing today? My name is Vernon Love, and I'm sort of a historian, bagpipe player, and I'd like to tell you a few things about my regalia here today. It's very meaningful to wear a kilt, and it has a lot of history behind it and a lot of symbolism. The original King of Scotland was Kenneth MacAlpin, and he brought together one of the first totally integrated societies in the world. They said it would never succeed and never last. And what he did, the Romans were trying to take over Scotland, And so they had to pull together to keep these Romans from taking over the area. And so, starting with my shoes, the symbolism that these shoes represent is the defeat of the Romans. Kind of a pun, defeat and feet. But what basically happened is the Romans had sandals on their shoes to wear on their feet, and the Scots people had developed a deerskin moccasin type thing that they would put over their feet, and it was laced up around their ankles. And when they put their foot in the water, the leather would swell, but then the leather laces would keep the shoe on their foot. Well, when the Romans would come up to fight, the Scots would get them to come up into the mountains where the brooks and streams are with all the sharp-pointed rocks. And then when the Romans put their foot into this water, well, of course, their sandals came off. And their poor little feet got cut up on the rocks, and they'd get over there and go, ooch, ouch. And then the Scottish people would take rocks, because they had no weapons or anything, and they just throw off rocks at the Romans and make them drop all their weapons. And then the Scots would go over there and take all their clothes off and make them go run back down the hill, but naked. And so that's what this represents, is they defeated the Romans not with weapons, but with their shoes. And so it's that symbol of faith and hope that you can win a battle without the weapons. You know. And of course the hose with the symbolism of the flashes represents the cloth held up by a string around their legs to keep their legs warm. And the kilt, at that time, it was a great kilt that was wrapped around. It was not only a piece of clothing, but it was a sleeping blanket. So at night in the cold mountains, they could use everything to keep warm. And of course, this sporran represented a food pouch that was full of oats that they could eat with. And then the hat, because everything that the Scotsman wore was usually made out of wool, it would repel water. So what they would do after they cooked their oats, they would put the food in the hat. And then they would eat, and then all they had to do was just wash it out. And so everything that I'm wearing represents the readiness of the Scottish army, including the weapons, that they did not go back home. When they were called to battle, they left immediately for the battlefield to fight. Okay, that's one of the major things about this outfit. Now, the bagpipes were banned in 1745 by the great Act of Proscription. Bagpipers were executed. And this battle was led by Bonnie Prince Charlie, who had come from Italy. His father had been exiled to Italy, but his father had married this Polish woman, so they had this son, Bonnie Prince Charlie, that was real fair-complected and beautiful. And when he came to Scotland, the women just, like Elvis Presley, they thought this was the most beautiful man they had ever seen. And so the women just loved this guy. But when he lost the battle, anybody that spoke the name Bonnie Prince Charlie, especially if they were a woman, the English would take a branding iron and brand their face. And so it was real detrimental to speak the name Bonnie Prince Charlie, or just Prince Charlie, or anything that had to do with the 1745. You'd be a traitor to the country. And so the women made up a code song about Bonnie Prince Charlie. And they would go sing this song to the English that had hired these ladies to work in the manors. And of course, the men, not to be outdone, made up a song that they could sing to the English in the English pubs and make the English buy the Scottish people a drink. So what I'm going to play for you are these code songs that we all know and love about Bonnie Prince Charlie and this great battle of 1745. The first song describes the departure of Bonnie Prince Charlie, where he went back to Italy over the Atlantic Ocean, back to Italy over the Mediterranean Sea. But they don't use the name Charlie. And of course, the last song, no one understands the words, but you will now. So I'm going to start off with the women's song.
Thank you.
Thank you. Was that a history lesson?
It was.
Henry White Talton. I was born in 1843. I joined the Confederate Army in June of '61. The Company G8 Louisiana was sent to Virginia to fight under Stonewall Jackson. We fought through '61 and '62 in the Valley campaigns. I was killed at Sharpsburg, Maryland in September the 17th of 1862. I was 21.
I'm Private John Aaron Sledge, Cashel, Louisiana. I'm a member of 28 Louisiana Infantry, Company A, called the Bienville Stars. Fought at the Battle of Pleasant Hill and Mansfield, and fought alongside these unknown Confederates that are in this trench right here. They're Texas troops. They fought along both sides of us. They was on the right and left flank of only 3 Louisiana regiments. There was 28 Texas regiments. They basically won the Battle of Pleasant Hill and Mansfield for us, and we owe them a lot of honor and a lot of respect. Talk about veterans a lot, and these guys are veterans along with World War I, World War II, Vietnam, and they deserve our honor and respect.
I'm Private Marcellus Ecclesiastes Bloom. I was born in 1842. I joined Company A, 9th Louisiana Infantry in July of 1861. I was shipped to the Virginia Theater. I served under Colonel at the time and became General Richard Taylor as part of Thomas Jonathan Jackson's Corps. I fought in the Shenandoah Valley campaigns in the battles of Winchester, Malvern Hill, Front Royal, also in the battles of 2nd Manassas and Sharpsburg. In December of 1862, I was wounded at the Battle of Fredericksburg. I was shipped home on a 60-day furlough to recuperate from my wound. I then transferred into the hospital in Shreveport, Louisiana, until I recuperated fully when I was rolled into the muster rolls of the Trans-Mississippi Department underneath Kirby Smith. I was surrendered and paroled in June of 1865 with the garrison at Shreveport. This trench was put in here after the Battle of Pleasant Hill and Mansfield. There were a lot of wounded, and they farmed out the wounded because they did not have a medical facility. And a large number of the wounded that were brought to Minden died and are buried in this trench. We don't know exactly how many are here. We do know one because his ancestors came about 5 years ago requesting to know where the trench was, and John Tillman brought them out here, and it appears that their relative had gotten a letter from a resident of Minden at the time and said that their son had died and that was buried in the Confederate trench. So that's the only one we know of.
I'd like to welcome y'all to my house. I'm Elizabeth Scott. I was married to Major Winfrey V. Scott. For several years, we came to Louisiana in the 1830s, well before the Civil War time. My husband enlisted and was made captain of a local group that came out of Minden. Our oldest son also joined. He was more into the cavalry, the big guns, the cannon, the artillery part of it. We've been worried about him. We look forward to any visitors that come through town to tell us about anything that's going on, because we don't get news that often. The last letter I had from my husband said he was on his way to Atlanta. Well, we've heard that Atlanta's going to burn, so I've been really, really worried about him. But I've taken this dread, whatever it is that's going through Louisiana with all the mosquitoes and the damp weather and the whatever. So I've been really afraid I was going to die before him and before I had a chance to tell him that I was sick or to see him again. He thinks his men can't get along without him, so he's on his way to another battle. The last I heard from my oldest son, he was on his way to Nashville because there's still fighting going on in Tennessee. Well, sure enough, Elizabeth Scott died in May of 1864. Her husband died just a few short weeks after, in June of 1864. Our youngest son that we had kept at home, that eventually joined too, but we had kept him at home, had to go after his father's body because he was killed in battle. Our other son was over the artillery part of that particular regiment, and when they got to Tennessee, he was killed at Nashville. Of course, I never knew that, so imagine their surprise when I was already there to meet and to greet them. Our youngest son went and got the bodies and brought them back to Louisiana. We appreciate y'all coming. Thank you.
Thank you. I was just sitting here doing my favorite thing, reading. Now, I am Ida Victoria Hill Woodward, and I started reading at the age of 3 years. I was so fortunate. I was the youngest of quite a few brothers and sisters, and their governess taught me when she was teaching them. So I was reading newspapers at the age of 7, and I still love to read. Now, I was born in 1838 in Concordia Parish. Now, that's at the Mississippi River. But at a young age, my parents moved us to what was then an Indian settlement in Arkansas. Now, this Indian settlement now has the name of Camden, Arkansas, and that's where I spent most of my young years. Now, at the age of 13, I was accepted in the Concordia Institute in Concordia, Tennessee, and I graduated at the age of 14. I was very fortunate in my young life. Now, I came to Minden as a housekeeper for Captain Goodwill. Now, he's not buried here. He's buried over there with his first wife. But anyway, we fell in love and married, and we had 3 children, Harry and Donald and Olive. Now, Olive was a family name that we carried on in the tradition. Captain Goodwill and I had a very happy life, but he was a rather stubborn man. Some of you might understand that. And we were building a new church, an Episcopal church. And of course, it's certainly not new now. It's been gone for about 50 years. But I was head of the women's division, and we chose some colored windows. Now, they weren't stained glass windows, but they were just colored windows. And Captain Goodwill objected. he didn't like, he dabbled in art a little bit. He was very good at charcoal. He was senior ward, which is kind of head of the layman of the congregation. And when he saw the windows going in, he said, I'll not go back in that church until those windows are gone. And do you know he didn't? I just couldn't believe it. But that's the way Captain Goodwin was. Now, as I told you, we had 3 children. Well, Olive married a Robert Roberts, and he became a judge in Shreveport. Fine, outstanding young man. We're so proud of her. And their daughter was named Olive. She married a man from South Louisiana whose father was governor of our state. And I was so proud of her. Well, they had a son that was my great-grandson named Mike. Now, you may recall Mike Foster was governor of the state of Louisiana. And do you know that sweet boy? I wrote him letters. I loved him so much. Even though I was so old, I wrote letters, and he had them published into a small little booklet. I thought that was so sweet. He's such a dear boy. And do you know, after he became governor, he came right here to visit me. That just made me feel so special. And it's been so special having you visit today. Thank you.
You notice over there by that tree, there's a tombstone almost overturned by the root. That's my final resting place. I'm John Watkins, Congressman John Watkins. I'm the son-in-law of Jury Myrtle. Now, let me tell you a little bit about myself before I get interrupted by that lame Sandlin. I'm the second 8-term congressman to be buried here in the Minden Cemetery. I ran for Congress in 1904. Before that, I was a district judge and a district attorney. The Louisiana Baptist Convention, I was president in 1902 when it was here in Minden. Then I heated debates in 1918 against Mr. Sandlin. And we went on for this. The first time I won, 1920, second time came around. A little rascal, he got me out of my office. Now, Mr. Sandlin, you know that my family did all we could to help you out. You know we gave you a place to study law in my uncle's office when your daddy got sick. How do you repay us? You don't go against me once, you go against me twice. Until you won. That's the only way you'd be satisfied. Now, you know that you did everything you could. And how would you put stuff about me, your supporters, in the newspaper? You know that I had to spend my congressional recess in Arizona because my wife and daughter had asthma. You know that. And you know I would come back to visit Minden. You didn't have to say I wouldn't do that. I know your daddy Nick real well. He wouldn't approve of this.
Judge Watkins, maybe the people were ready for someone a little younger to lead them in office.
And I couldn't help what those boys said about you in their ads, because I didn't pay for a single one of them. And I never even mentioned you not coming back to Minden. I said you were out of touch with Minden because of the way you were voting up there in Congress. My dad, Nick, was a populist. He believed in the common folk. You started hanging out with that Champs Clark crowd, and well, you just forgot about your boys back here in Minden. When you sided with President Wilson, when you sided with Clark over President Wilson over the way, you cost yourself that election. And I'm real sorry about the way the election turned out. Well, at least the bitter part. If you thought that was rough, you should have been around here when Huey Long came around. Man, he was a rascal. He helped beat me out of election after he was 6 months dead. Folks, I'm sorry to be fighting like this in front of y'all. I'd love to sit back and tell you some of Daddy's tales about the Minden Blues and the Civil War. And I'm sure Judge Watkins can tell you all about his dad starting the Mill Academy. But I gotta get back to my plot. I have 2 wives up here. Miss Ruth, well, she's a sweetheart, but Miss Emma, she keeps me on pretty tight rein.
Hello folks, my name is Samuel J. Webb. I was born on September 3rd, 1862 in Homer. You see, my father was a doctor in that area. I always seemed to have a knack for making different kinds of contraptions. I was always kind of shy, so I let my brother Robert do a lot of the talking for me. My most famous invention was the Webb cotton compress. But I also invented more than 200 other devices, and at the time of my death was working on improving methods for drilling oil and gas. The compress was invented in the 1880s and was advertised as the largest and most powerful in the world. The device used steam power to compress bales of cotton into a smaller size for more convenient shipping and handling. After that business took off, I spent less time in Minden. I journeyed out to the east, overseeing the manufacture of my machines. The presses were built in York, Pennsylvania, and later constructed by the Scott Foundry in Reading, Pennsylvania. The Dorcheat Historical Society Museum has a nameplate from one of these machines manufactured in Reading. By 1890s, the business was so big that I asked my family members to come help. My brother Robert was a big help. The Webb Press Company was chartered by the state of Louisiana on March 7, 1902. And sold its devices to cotton growers in all parts of the U.S. and even in other countries. After all this cotton business, I wanted to look at other adventures. Oil was something new and exciting for me. I was in Minden on Sunday, April 6, 1909. I was visiting the home of Colonel Ford, and as you can see, it wasn't a good day for me. I was struck down by a fatal heart attack. After 40 minutes, I never regained consciousness. I never married and left my business enterprises to my brother Robert. The top of my headstone was broken off during the tornado of May 1st, 1933. The Webb marker was replaced and the broken section was used to make the marker for the unknown Confederate graves, buried in the southwestern corner of the graveyard. I'll call it the trench. Well, I'll let my brother Robert read the talking from here on.
I was born in Homer, Louisiana on June 1st, 1867. After my schooling locally, I went to attend Tulane University, where I earned my MD degree in 1892. I came home to Minden to set up my practice as a doctor. In 1895, my brother needed my help with his business, with the Webb cotton press. I was always more outgoing than Sam, so I took on the job of handling the public end of our business. Sam liked the inventing part. After Sam died, I became the head of the Webb Press Company. But like Sam and I knew, oil was where the future lay. In 1922, I worked out instruction and personally financed the discovery of well number 1 in Cotton Valley oil field. The well was completed on August 25, 1922, and sparked the oil boom in northern Webster Parish. From that point on, I was primarily involved in oil and gas industry. The Webster Parish Company was reorganized in 1926, and the management of the company was placed in the hands of some of my other relatives. I was an active member of the First Methodist Church for more than 50 years. I served on the board of steward and was a member of the board of trustees of the Methodist Church Children's Home in Ruston. I died on December 21st, 1950, and like my brother, I never married. Some of mine's massive fortune was left to our siblings, nieces and nephews, friends, and the Methodist Children's Home. Thank y'all.
Thank you.
We're a little ahead. We'll just give them time to.
Been forgotten again, but here you are. I am Ada Jack Carver. I was born in Natchitoches in 1890 to a genteel family who loved the arts and literature, and they taught me my love of art. My daddy used to take us to New Orleans to Shakespearean plays. And I would come back and write my own plays, and my sisters and I would act them out. I always loved to write, and my first story was published at the age of 17. I went to the Normal in Natchitoches when I went to college, and I graduated from there, and I was asked to give the address at my graduation, which was quite an honor. I married in 1918 at the age of 27. My husband was J.B. Snell. He was a summer instructor at the Normal, and he was a soldier, and in World War I, we went to New York. He sailed for Europe, and I stayed and took a short story course at Columbia University. When he came back, we moved to Natchitoches. My first child was born in 1919, little John. In 1920, J.B. was asked to be the president of the Minden Cotton Oil and Ice Company. And so we moved to Minden. Minden. Nuevo Roche it was called, up in the clay hills of North Louisiana. Quite different from Natchitoches. Anyway, we came, and in 1921, my beloved little John was tragically killed. When we came back from a long walk, he needed a bath, so we poured boiling water into the tub, and then we always filled it with cold. But somehow little John got in the tub before the cold water, and he was scalded and died. A few hours later, my son David was born, and we lived through that tragedy for quite some time. In 1922, I built a writer's cottage, which is still in Minden today. It is over on Oak Knoll. It's where Jack and Cleo Cook now live. It was just perfect. I did not like Minden at first, but it actually provided what I needed for my stories, because it was here that I wrote my most powerful and memorable story. I'd like to read you an article, or part of an article that I wrote for the Retrace a few years after I came to Minden. When I first came to Minden, I thought, this town is too staid, too complacent, too engrossed in her own affairs. Minden is missing something of the beauty and the meaning of life. Of course, I loved and cherished the old. I loved the gardens. I loved the old homes, high set,
white pillared with the wide galleries and broad, beautiful doorways. They testify to a social order that went back 100 years, a time of gracious and pleasant living, long before the war. And yet, as I look back upon it, I think I missed the French gaiety, the freedom, and the charming casualness of Natchitoches. But with Minden's material advancement, there has come an accompanying mental change, a psychological broadening of outlook and viewpoint, an awareness and a vigor, and a growing sense of perspective and humor. Towns and cities have personality. They have color and fragrance and sound. Natchitoches, which still possesses part of my heart, is a high-born, accomplished old lady. She keeps right up with the times, but because it is vastly becoming, she chooses to dress in sprigged silk and crinoline with a pink Duchess rose in her hair. And Minden, she's accomplished too. She's not as old as Natchitoches, not as quaint, and not so much of a flirt. By day, she's a businesswoman, but at night, you can hear her laugh with the moonlight caught in her hair. And Minden has bobbed her locks, by the way. Can this, too, be a form of nervousness, a sort of divine discontent? She is efficient, poised, and charming, and she has beauty and brains. And I closed by saying, and I love my town because of her integrity, the integrity of her banks and her business houses, her parochial and city officials, and her people in general. Minden to me is like a bride with something old, something new, something borrowed, and something blue. Blue? The joyous blue of her skies in June, of undulating hills that slope to the Ozarks, the blue of strange flowers, the blue of autumn, and the true blue of her citizenship. Altogether, Minden is a pleasant place in which to live. But I also told my friend, Miss Tammy Henry, I felt I wanted to speak a good word for my hometown. They've been so wonderful to me here. But I also told her how I hate to cater to the matrons of Minden by attending their social gatherings. I was sort of reclusive. Anyway, I went on to the height of my career in the 1920s. I won many national prizes and awards, and I wrote my best stories. I got to know some of the fine Southern writers, and I was compared to the best of the best. I was even called the best of my time. My stories, Red Bone, Treachy, Cotton Dolly, Raspberry Dress, were all highly acclaimed, and all were about a mixture of Cane River people, the Red Bones, the Creoles, the Mulattoes, and the others. Most of my stories were chosen to be among the top short stories each year. And I still spend a lot of time in Natchitoches, especially at Melrose with Miss Cammy, with writers like Lyle Saxon, Rachel Field, Roark Bradford, and other fine Southern writers. We all loved exchanging ideas. But at the height of my career, when I was on the very top, I gave it all up. I gave up the literary work. I guess I wanted to spend my time with my David, who, by the way, became a fine writer in his own right. My last published work was for the Centenary Review. It was called Pursuing with Love, and it was written in 1949. After that, I became what most people would call an eccentric. I walked around town a lot, which I'd always done, but I can remember little children pointing and saying, "Look, Mama, there's that woman, the one who always wears a hat and has that funny mouth." But I didn't care. I knew who I was and what I had done. I left this world in 1972, rather reclusive, having lived out my last days in Meadowview Nursing Home, forgotten by the literary world you be the judge. Thank you. Now y'all need to go to the coat and see some more history. And they do have refreshments there. Well,
thank you for coming. Oh, tired out. Look at that. Y'all go by the coat plant now. Refreshments. Thank you so much.
I've got a lot of